Hello again, everyone. This week we're looking at child neglect and psychological maltreatment. There is quite a bit of material in this chapter, and what I'm going to do most likely, unless this recorded lecture goes a little more quickly than I anticipate it will, is to break this up into two parts, just for your own convenience, more or less. There are different philosophies about whether a longer presentation, just one presentation to click on, where someone can sit down and focus on it and move on, is better than having a series of smaller lectures that are put together to create the whole. And so I'm going to experiment a little bit with this. You might like this presentation a little better if it's broken into two pieces. Just because of the fact that there's going to be a lot of material in here. And really, when we talk about child neglect and we talk about psychological maltreatment, or sometimes referred to as emotional abuse, we're really talking about things that are intertwined but still are distinct, somewhat different types of violence on children. So this week we start with a look at child neglect, and the question is, what is child neglect? How do we define it? And that's something that really is open to a lot of interpretation. And one of the first questions you have to ask yourself is neglect simply an act of omission where parents refuse to do certain things that their children require? Or can it also be an act of commission where parents do specific things that result in their children's needs not being met? However you look at it, child neglect is the most frequently reported form of child maltreatment across the United States. There are different textbooks that will tell you this, and my own log at my desk in the Child Protection Office in Kenai says that about 40 to 45% of all the referrals that come in have an element, or 40 to 45% of the complaints that come into our office have an element of child neglect involved in it, and that's almost twice as much as the second to the most frequent type of referral, which is physical abuse. So it is frequently reported. But the definition, as I said, the definition of child neglect is something that is widely open to dispute and debate. One of the things that you have to do when you start thinking about this topic is to recognize that sometimes parents fail to provide things and options are not available to them to do so. For instance, in cases of very poor families where parents make appropriate decisions with the money they do have at their disposal but still cannot make ends meet and provide for their children, those parents are not being neglectful if they can't provide for their children. If, however, they do have income that they can do that, and they're spending money on other things such as drugs or something else, then that could be considered neglectful. We don't really know. I mean, and again, this is something that you can talk about for a long time to try to determine what are children's basic needs. I think we're going to look at that a little bit more closely in another panel or two here. You also have to ask yourself when you're looking at situations involving families, is this an intentional act on the part of the parent, or are there circumstances in the environment or in the situation that need to be considered before you determine that parents are neglectful? Do we just look at demonstrable harm, that is, where you can see and already children have suffered from some debilitating effects of the parent's behavior or lack of behavior? Or can we step in cases of potential harm where if things continue as they are, things are going to get that bad and kids will be harmed? That's another way of kind of looking at this, and another question that a lot of people would debate, believe it or not. How often does this occur? How long has it occurred? We know that chronic neglect is much, much more harmful than short-term neglect. So those kinds of things are all questions that help you to define the different kinds of scenarios that you run into when you talk about the topic of child neglect. And in another area that's sort of an area of dynamic discussion these days is the rights of unborn children. And are children, fetuses, alive? And if they are alive, then do the states have the right to intervene if, say, for instance, a parent is abusing substances while she's pregnant or drinking a lot of alcohol? You know, we're very clear on the harm that drinking causes to fetuses when mothers are pregnant, and should states be able to intervene in those situations? That's another area that is ripe for discussion. So what specific behaviors should be included in the neglect category? And there is a consensus definition in the textbook that I rather like. Really, it covers most of the areas we look at. That is the failure to provide basic necessities of life, such as food, clothing, and shelter. and refusal to seek or delay, I should say this, and also refusal to seek or delay in seeking health care, abandonment of a child, inadequate supervision, refusal of custody requirements, educational neglect, developmental neglect. All of those kinds of areas are types of things that parents do or don't do that fall into this category. And there is this also the topic of emotional neglect itself, failing to provide for the emotional development and emotional security of your child. And is that different from psychological maltreatment, or are they the same thing? We're going to be talking about psychological maltreatment later in this lecture. Medical neglect, basic health care needs not being met. Sometimes parents have the right, however, to make decisions on behalf of their children that the state probably should not be able to intervene. For instance, if a parent has a child who has attention deficit disorder and the psychiatrist that sees this child writes a prescription for medication to help the child get along better in school, should that parent be required to fill that prescription even if they're not sure they want to do that, because there are side effects to medication and there are other ways of treatment, but that is the most popular and the quickest remedy for a situation like that. Likewise, certain individuals for religious reasons refuse medical treatment when children are seriously ill. Should the state intervene in those types of situations, or should their rights to take action based on their own moral sense be the thing that overrules everything else? And particularly in our area here in Alaska, but elsewhere around the United States, there are large segments of individuals who refuse to permit vaccinations of their children and believe that vaccinations are harmful for their children and worry about the side effects of them in the long run. So these are all areas that can be considered under the rubric of this discussion. Child neglect is the most frequently reported and most frequently substantiated form of child maltreatment in the United States. This is not only is it reported more frequently, but it's also substantiated more frequently by child protection investigators. The most common form of neglect reported in different studies that have been done around the United States was leaving a child alone when adults should be present. Lack of supervision was the most common form of child neglect reported. There's a pretty good statement in the textbook that says child neglect in the first 2 years of life may be a more important precursor of childhood aggression than later neglect or physical abuse of any age. When we talk about the different kinds of cases that come before us, and we're sometimes almost overwhelmed by images that we get of children who have been abused physically or even sexually, and the harm that has come to them, when workers get a referral for a neglectful family, it almost feels like, oh, this is just neglect and this can wait because we have these other things that I have to tend to first, where children are really being hurt. And it's important for child protection workers to realize that although things are not necessarily urgent and emergent with a neglect situation, nonetheless they are still as very important. And study after study is showing that neglectful situations, that chronic neglect hurts children in the long run more than any other form of abuse. So we really need to not think of it as just neglect. In fact, there is evidence that suggests that early neglect modifies the body's stress response, and there'll be more about this a little bit later on, and we'll be coming back to that fact a number of times during the semester, in fact. Because neglect is so often intertwined with other forms of child maltreatment, sometimes it's really hard for researchers to really determine and isolate what are the effects of the neglect versus the effects of other forms of maltreatment. But nonetheless, these are some of the things that we think we know about child neglect. Now I want to stop for a moment, and this the textbook refers to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, but it doesn't go into it in great detail. It is something that's very interesting, and I have a few panels here that I want to talk about the ACE study, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This was a study conducted, I believe, in 2006 or 2007 by Kaiser Permanente. And Kaiser Permanente has a very large insurance group that provides group health insurance for workers all around the United States. So it's a very large insurer, and they did surveys of 17,000 of their patients participating in routine health screening. These were all people who volunteered for the survey also, which is a particularly kind of elite group, because people who don't volunteer probably for this survey may have more issues that that they just don't want to talk about. So these are volunteers who are participating in this study. And another thing that well, I mean, they're still looking at this data, but it's just a staggering proof of all the kinds of problems that are associated with childhood trauma. And one of the interesting things here is that most of the participants, first of all, they were adults, and they were enrolled in Kaiser Permanente's group healthcare plans, so they're working, relatively well-functioning members of society. These are individuals that are not in most of the studies that you look at in this textbook. The studies, this incident study and that national survey of this or whatever, usually are studying children in child protection caseloads and families in women's shelters and those kinds of things. These are individuals who probably aren't in most of those studies, or may not be in those studies at least. So these are people who are functioning on a day-to-day basis very well. And so these people were asked about the frequency and severity of forms of abuse and dysfunction in the households that they grew up in during their first 18 years. And here are the kinds of things that were identified as some of the adverse, and I believe there were a number of others as well, but some of the adverse childhood experiences that they were asked about, recurrent physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, alcohol or drug abuse by a family member or themselves, incarcerated family member, someone who's chronically depressed, suicidal, mentally ill, or institutionalized because of that, a mother being treated violently, one or no biological parents, emotional or physical neglect. And what they found in the course of this study is that the individuals identified, however many of those they experienced in their life, and that the more of those kind of adverse experiences that occurred in these fully functioning individuals' backgrounds, the more likely it is that they were going to be making claims on the health insurance program because of illnesses and different kinds of diseases and problems. Many of the common causes of death and disability in the United States, things that include smoking, obesity, physical inactivity, alcoholism, drug abuse, depression, suicide attempts, sexual promiscuity, those kinds of things, can be traced to adverse emotional experiences in childhood. And you can kind of see from this pyramid how it relates, that you have the ACEs early in childhood leading to some sort of social or emotional impairment. And so as a result of that, the individual adopts health risky behaviors such as smoking, overeating, a sedentary lifestyle, drinking, those kinds of things. Develop disease, disability, social problems as a result of that, and ultimately, reach an early death. And it is really a very powerful study, and you can Google ACE study and read all about it. Really, it's very interesting. Adverse childhood experiences lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors that can be used as coping mechanisms for whatever problems the individual is experiencing as a child. And we'll be talking a little bit about that. Some of the we'll be touching on that later on, I think, in the psychological maltreatment, about how some individuals adopt certain behaviors to cope with those stressors as a child and carry them through into the adult years to their own disservice. A person with an ACE score of 4, that's 4 of those events, is more than 460% likely to suffer from depression than a person with a score of 0. There was a 1,220% increase in a history of attempted suicide between a 4 and a 0 ACE score. And in assessing the population, 4 out of 5 of the participants who attempted suicide, 80% of those suicides could be attributed to adverse childhood experiences. And a male child with an ACE score of 6 has a 4,600% increase in the likelihood of later becoming an IV drug user. This is just some of the correlates here. It's just amazing. And a lot of people believe that when things happen to you in your life, and particularly when you're a child, that you're resilient, and we know about resilient children, and that we just get on with things, we move on, we leave it behind us, and the ACE study really shows us that doesn't happen. That you may move on and you may develop coping techniques. And find ways to manage the effects of those adverse experiences, but that doesn't mean you're healthy. And in fact, many of the coping techniques that we're using perhaps to deal with those things on a day-to-day basis are hurting us slowly but surely. There are lots of brain studies in infants and children and adolescents that have been exposed to violence in the home as well, that indicate that children who are exposed to violence have, well, their brains look and develop differently than children who aren't exposed to violence. Later in the semester, we have a whole learning unit that will be devoted to the effects of violence on children, and I have some interesting material for you to read, and some new stuff that, in fact, I just was exposed to recently myself. What happens when children are exposed to violence, basically, they continue to, as a matter of survival, when you live in a violent environment, you operate in that section of the brain that has to do with the fight and flight response. Always on edge, always scanning, always ready to protect self if necessary in order to get out of a situation. And so little children who are in a violent environment, their brains begin to overdevelop that particular area of the brain. And what happens later on then is these individuals have a lot of emotional problems, have difficulties in relationships, may overreact to things and perceive threats when they don't exist, probably have difficulty learning because you can't really kind of be in your cortex learning and thinking and reading if you're always on guard ready for the next thing to happen. We don't just move on. We don't just get over things. These things hurt us when we're children and change our brains. There's been more research also on the effects of neglect, and the studies here do suggest a relationship between neglect and disturbed patterns of infant caretaker attachment. And so you're looking at attachment studies. This is probably not too surprising when you really think about it, but 70% of the infants in the United States experience what we call a secure attachment. This is, a connection to a parent or an adult caregiver that provides for that child's needs, that when the child needs something, the child's experiences teach him or her that they can count on this individual will be there to take care of them. This is a secure attachment. This is a child who knows that if they make a mistake, they're still loved, those kinds of things. And so these children develop into people who are confident and able to regulate their own emotions. But about 30% of United States infants develop insecure, or sometimes it's called anxious attachments. And their parents lack the sensitivity to their needs as an infant and provide inconsistent or unresponsive care. They just don't respond sometimes to the baby's needs. And so the infant eventually grows to feel powerless and develops avoidant or ambiguous attachments that can bring about aggression and bullying and social withdrawal, just a general lack of ability to cope with life. And there's an even smaller minority of infants that develop what's called a disorganized attachment. And these infants, this is sort of a new area for me, the disorganized attachment. I'm very used to secure and insecure attachments, but disorganized is just so disturbed that really kind of leads to psychopathology in later years. And there is an indication, there's evidence that attachment styles are passed on intergenerationally. So children with insecure attachments, well, think about this. I mean, when children with insecure attachments to their parents, when they go striking out as young adults or as adolescents and begin to form one-on-one relationships with another partner, they may enter those relationships with the same kinds of insecurities because that's their experience in relationships. And so they don't tend to be good partners. They don't tend to be happy marriage. They don't tend to have happy marriages and those kinds of things. And so their own children oftentimes are going to grow up with the same kinds of lack of security in their attachments as well. There are other studies, such as the Minnesota Longitudinal Study, and the Longitudinal Study means that this was over the course of a number of years this study was conducted, showed that a significantly higher proportion of neglected children were anxiously attached at 12 and 18 months, had social difficulties through elementary school, and as they approached adulthood, 9 out of 10 of them had at least one mental health diagnosis. The emotionally neglected child were more likely to receive a diagnosis than the physically neglected. 73% had more than one diagnosis, and over half of the physically neglected kids had dual diagnosis, comorbid, they call it, situations where it's not only mental health but substance abuse problems as well. Both neglected and abused children tend to have poor academic performance, and neglected children have lower scores on language and reading, but not abused kids. So here again, you see that sometimes kids who are neglected are still experiencing more damage. And again, when you think about the fact that a lot of this probably relates to brain development and brain stimulation as the child grows up, it's probably not too surprising. Child neglect victims oftentimes exhibit emotional and behavioral difficulties, and will have exhibit a mixture of psychiatric disorders at different times in their life, personality disorders as well. Think about what this predicts for later functioning in their later years, again, just like we were talking about a bit ago. The most serious consequence for physical neglect, of course, is death, and neglect is the form of child maltreatment that is most often associated with death in child maltreatment. There's also another type of neglect that you'll hear about in the field is this failure to thrive. Growth is either stopped or significantly slowed in the first 3 years of life, so that physically their weight and their height and everything is way below the curve of where it should be. The growth charts, you've probably seen them, way off those growth charts. And what you do in situations like that is we have to kind of determine, is this an organic or non-organic failure to thrive. Organic failure to thrive can be related to a lot of physical conditions that really prevent the body from absorbing or processing nutrients like most children's bodies would. But non-organic failure to thrive is usually the result of neglect and parents, again, not responding to children's needs. And it goes beyond the physical condition of the child, but also how they interact with other people, because they're not emotionally satisfied. They tend to be very lethargic babies themselves, and they don't really respond to other human beings like most babies do when you walk up and talk to them. And one way to do this, at least with a failure to thrive baby, is to put the baby in the hospital for 3 or 4 days and see if the growth picks up or not, because oftentimes they begin to recover very rapidly in non-organic failure to thrive, whereas in organic failure to thrive we wouldn't see that change. The National Incidence Study, the NIS-4, taken between 2005 and 2006, found 771,000 plus children being neglected according to the harm standard. Now, that is not the potential harm, but the actual harm standard. This is based on child protection records and professional records and reports. So I think the 61%, and I'm sorry, I'm not positive about this. I'd have to go back and look in the book, but I think the 61% relates to 61% of the cases maybe had neglected, and I really don't know. But anyway, the point here is almost 772,000 children in that study were neglected. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services did a study a few years later, identified 758,000 maltreated children, and of those, 71% were neglected. So this is what the other statistics talking about, that of 771,000 children in the NIS study, 61% were neglected. In the HHS study, 71% were neglected, and a little more than half of those were female, without any significant racial disparities in the percentage of neglect. Neglectful parents in the NIS-4, 92% of the perpetrators were biological parents, 86% were female. Now, that doesn't mean that mothers are worse parents by any stretch, or more neglectful parents by any stretch of the imagination. What this tells you is that, well, first of all, the caretakers, usually a female in families, and secondly, it has something to do with the gender bias of workers who are investigating, that the expectation is that mothers will tend to the needs of children even when the fathers are absent and aren't providing for them. So that if, for instance, you have a home where a parent was failing to provide for children, and say the father has recently left the home a week or a month before and wasn't maintaining contact with the children, the finding might be just about the mother's neglectful behavior that called us to the house, and not even address the fact that the father's not there helping her out. That's just one of those things that has to do with gender bias that we all have to be very careful about in this field. The ACE study, which again, is a retrospective report, individuals talking about what happened to them as children. The retrospective report of childhood experiences of neglectful parents, 27% had substance abuse problems in their family of origin, 19% had mental illness in the household, there was parental divorce in about a quarter of those families, and 1 in 20 had an incarcerated household member. So these are adults who are neglectful parents talking about their own childhood experiences. So you can see some of the intergenerational transmission there. And finally, and this is just an interesting point as well, neglecting parents tend to interact less with their children. You might think, well, that's by definition, that makes sense. But anyway, just follow along here. They interact less with their children, and what interactions they do have with their children tend to be less positive, and there's evidence that suggests that they have more negative interactions with their children. The nature, the quality of the interactions neglectful parents would have with their children is problematic as well. And so for some of those children, sometimes they may be happier not having interaction with their parent perhaps. So that covers the segment on neglect, and as I promised you, I'm going to stop this tape, save this, and part 2 is coming up next, and this will be talking about psychological maltreatment. So be sure to click on the next one as well.